Welcome, everyone, welcome back to JMB on RPGs, and if you haven't figured it out already from parts 2 and 3, I love me some Final Fantasy VII! I love it! Final Fantasy VII is my most favorite RPG of all time, and also my favorite game of all time, and this should come to no surprise at all when you consider it is also the first major RPG I have ever completed in my life. Yes! After a whole childhood of frustration, agony, and embarrassing failures at the hands of Dragon Warrior 1 and Final Fantasy 1, I finally knew what it was like to complete a major RPG. And yes, though I did in fact complete Super Mario RPG first a year before 7, I'm telling you right now, putting a smithy in his grave, though awesome, does not compare to putting an end to a Sephiroth, a Kefka, a Lavos, or a Gygas. Those are the kind of victories that stay with you forever. And in no way is it coincidental that I just mentioned all these iconic RPG villains, because they all come from what can almost unanimously be considered to be, across the board, by just about every critic and fan, to be the greatest console RPG games of all time, along with Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy X. And interestingly enough, usually, whichever one of these games a player first completes in their life, Final Fantasy IV, 6, 7, 10, Chrono Trigger, or Earthbound, 9 times out of 10, this game usually tends to become that player's most favorite RPG game of all time, and therefore, their most favorite video game of all time. Why? Well, more on that soon on a later episode of JMB on RPGs, but for right now, let's pick up where we last left off after JMB on RPGs Part 3. Where we last left off, Final Fantasy VII had not only changed the entire gaming industry forever, but also the entire generation of us gamers that had played it in 97 and 98. So, as far as Square was concerned, now what? Well, that's a very interesting question, because the other major video gaming fantasy franchise, one I begrudgingly admit is even bigger than Final Fantasy, was in the exact same situation. Nintendo. Nintendo and The Legend of Zelda. I walked off the path and I wasn't prepared. There, I said it. Like Final Fantasy VII, Legend of Zelda had not only successfully made the jump to 3D better than just about any video game ever made, but also, like Final Fantasy VII, Zelda was enjoying a resounding, never-before-experienced blockbuster of a success, breaking all sorts of sales records by attracting a whole new audience to their franchise that had never even considered playing a Zelda before. Both companies had the greatest problem a franchise could ever have: too much success! And they both dealt with it in completely different ways. Nintendo dealt with it by being seemingly intimidated by Ocarina of Time's success as to what Zelda game should follow next, but Square was clearly anything but intimidated by Final Fantasy VII's success, and Square would continue to spend the rest of their franchise's history trying to top themselves with every single sequel. But who delivered? Well, Nintendo gave us Majora's Mask and Wind Waker, and Square gave us Final Fantasy VIII, 9, and 10 next, but as I've already made a Majora's Mask video, and if you've seen it, you already know how I feel about that one. And since I haven't made a Wind Waker video yet, I'm pleading the fifth as far as that one is concerned. But as far as Final Fantasy VIII goes, I can tell you a shit ton, because I was there, man. I was effing there the very minute it came out at ground zero. Final Fantasy VIII is the only game I have ever pre-ordered in my entire life. You cannot imagine, after 7, how excited I was for this game to finally come out. For almost 2 years I waited patiently, playing every single PlayStation 1 RPG I could afford to get my hands on back then. Parasite Eve, Final Fantasy Tactics, Brave Fencer Musashi, and Lunar, Silver Star Story, which were all good RPGs for the time, all good RPGs in their own right, especially Dear Lunar, but all were nothing more than mere foreplay to me, frankly. Nothing more than a distraction while I waited for Final Fantasy VIII to finally come out and hopefully blow my mind! Hopefully giving me the second greatest gaming experience of my life since 7. So, did it? On September 9th, 1999, 9/9/99, when Final Fantasy VIII finally launched and I finally got my hands on a copy, and I popped that first disc into my gray-colored PlayStation and I got my first glimpse of that first cutscene, yes, my mind was in fact fucking blown. And I knew as soon as I saw that opening cutscene that I really must have been in for something special, right? Everything was top-notch in Final Fantasy VIII. Not just the cutscenes, but everything. Absolutely everything. Square had clearly spared no expense. Final Fantasy VIII was like the Sistine Chapel of RPGs for its time. I'm not kidding. Top to bottom, it was so beautiful, so elegant. Almost everything in that game had been dramatically improved since 7. The music sounded better, much more orchestral and less synthesized. The graphics were 10 times better, some of the best graphics you were ever going to see on a PlayStation 1 game. No more blocky characters, no more pre-rendered backgrounds. It looked like you were walking on a digital painting rather than playing inside a real game world. Final Fantasy VIII's world was real as it was going to get for 1999. More major towns, multiple governments, and factions, even as 8 dared to push the modernism that had so differentiated 7 from every other previous RPG even further. Absolutely everything was improved in 8. Absolutely everything was elevated and elegant. Everything except for the story and the characters, which, excuse me, is a pretty big fucking deal in RPGs. As I've already said over and over again on previous videos, to be a great game, a lot of the time you don't need a whole lot of story. In fact, more often than not, it is the least important part of a great game. Most of the time, you just need to give the player some one-of-a-kind gameplay mechanics and some good tunes to listen to while they play. But the opposite is true for RPGs. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important to an RPG than story and characters. Characters and story are the tent pole that holds everything up in an RPG, and if your RPG's story is one flooded with subpar, two-dimensional, whiny, unrelatable characters, if you have a virtually non-existent antagonist that only gets mentioned at the back end of the game and does not even show up until the very end of the game, and if your fantasy story has a plot so convoluted and is so laughably, time-travel-y, terribly, ridiculously silly, then it really doesn't matter how good your graphics, designs, or music are, or how many CGI cutscenes you manage to stuff into a couple of PlayStation discs. Your RPG will forever be missing something that would otherwise make it a truly magnificent gaming experience. And if you don't believe me, well, just look at all previous RPGs before 7 and 8. Everything from Dragon Warrior 1 to Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Earthbound. They all look and sound pretty antiquated in comparison, and even for their time, they were often considered to be, by many such as myself, I'm sorry, to be graphically poor and slow and wordy and boring and therefore unplayable. And yet, in light of this, people back in the 80s and 90s still fell in love with them and played them by the droves. And even decades later, though their graphics and sound are even more out of date than when they first launched, people are still constantly discovering them, playing them, talking about them, raving about them, and yet in no way you can 100% say this about Final Fantasy VIII. Why? Because though all those older RPGs were eliminated by their technology of the time, they still delivered two things that are always limited more by creativity and imagination than they ever are by technology. Good characters and good story. That is the power of good character and good story right there, and that is the one thing Final Fantasy VIII was seriously lacking. And don't get me wrong, when I say that, I still loved playing Final Fantasy VIII and still do. I still loved the junction system, the card game, the Guardian Forces, the limit breaks. They were all top-notch and a whole lot of fun back then, but that story, man. For those of you unfamiliar with Final Fantasy VIII's story is that of Squall Leonhart, and I think the main problem with this game's story lies with him. Squall isn't that likable of a main character for almost the entire game. He's something of a douche. At first, after a few hours of playing, you might think to yourself it's because Squall seems to be such a very cold and emotionless person, unable to shake anyone's hand or even look anyone in the eye unless he's fighting with them. But the truth is, Squall wasn't a cold or emotionless person at all. Quite the opposite, actually. Squall was, in fact, an extremely emotional and sensitive person deep down. And this, of course, is not what makes him a douche. No! What makes him a douche is that he always acted as if he was the only emotional and sensitive person on the whole planet, and everyone else in the world were all, in fact, a bunch of misunderstanding jerks. For most of Final Fantasy VIII, Squall could not possibly have given less of a rat's ass about anyone's feelings beside his own. And yet, in spite of this, everyone around him did nothing but repeatedly try to cheer him up, be his friend, or even be his lover sometimes. And yet he repeatedly, in turn, continued to throw it back in everyone's faces in disgust. How is that not the definition of a jerky douchebag? And why did Square ever think any of us would want to play a game for 40 hours with a guy like this at the helm? Why indeed? Now, as a main character, Squall eventually does get better, more likable, less douchey when you finally see him admit to himself and to a comatose Rinoa that the truth is, in his own words, "To tell you the truth, I worry too much about what people think of me. I hate that side of me. That's why I didn't want anyone to get to know me. I wanted to hide that side of myself. I hate it." Squall hated himself. He was embarrassed about who he was deep down, so he wanted to keep everyone away so that no one would ever find out about it. It's understandable, that happens sometimes. Still no reason to be a dick about it, but it happens. From there, the story of Final Fantasy VIII gets a whole lot better too. When you see how much Squall really cares for Rinoa, and you see how hard he fights to save her and protect her over and over again, no matter what the cost. He goes so far to even admit to himself, and to us the audience, that even if Rinoa ends up becoming an evil sorceress herself, like Ultimisia, that he will still continue to protect her and stand by her to the bitter end. Well, that makes for a damn good story right there. But the problem with Final Fantasy VIII will forever be that it takes 2/3 of the game to finally get there, for the story to finally get good, and the fact that in real life, when you act like Squall did all the time, nobody wants to constantly go out of their way to cheer you up, be your friend, and or sleep with you. They usually do the opposite of these things. They usually just ignore you, and rightfully so, because, believe it or not, nobody likes a douche. Okay, so, in closing about Final Fantasy VIII, was 8 as great of a gaming experience for me as 7? No, not even close. Was it still a fun gaming experience? Sure, and I can still have fun with 8. Does it belong on any lists for the top 10 greatest RPGs of all time? No, of course not. Definitely not, and yet still it's worth noting that not only did Final Fantasy VIII sell over 8 million copies, but there's a whole lot of us that played it back in 99 and 2000 that, believe it or not, still have a lot of sentimental attachment to this game because, let's not forget, most of us were in fact a bunch of young adolescents and teenagers ourselves when we first played it, and a lot of us were in fact a whole lot like Squall. And that right there might very well simultaneously be the reason why so many people hated Final Fantasy VIII back then and still do. Maybe this one hit a lot of us a little too close to home. Or maybe they just didn't like the junction system. So, A year later, with not nearly as much hype behind it, Final Fantasy IX came out, and if you picked it up, half of us didn't actually after 8, but if you did, Final Fantasy IX was a lot of fun. 9 was this really cool throwback title, returning FF to its roots, filled with references to Final Fantasy I that even I got. That guy's called Garland! Reminding everyone of the days when Final Fantasy was nothing but swords, sorcery, and black mages. Vivi rules! And if you were like me, and you did in fact get your butt oh so handed to you oh so many times, back in the 8-bit days, Final Fantasy IX was your chance to return to the old school Final Fantasy world and kick ass and chew bubble gum. With a goofy main character that had a monkey tail of all things. And then came Final Fantasy X, which, as already aforementioned, is one of the greatest RPG games of all time. Why? Well, sure, like with 8, Square had upped their game yet again. Better PlayStation 2 graphics, no more fixed camera angles, a fantastic, one-of-a-kind art style that can only be described as Tibet meets Mardi Gras, and the entire game was voiced over, a monumental RPG first for the time. So yeah, just like 8, everything was top-notch again. Another RPG Sistine Chapel. But unlike 8, this time, Final Fantasy VIII had a top-notch story and fantastic characters to boot. Final Fantasy X's story and characters are some of the greatest of all time, easily on equal standing ground with Final Fantasy VI and VII. And some people even think it to be better than 7. Not me, of course. You will never ever hear those words come out of my mouth, but that doesn't change the fact how much I fucking love Final Fantasy X. I love this game and its story so fucking much. Final Fantasy X should not have been called Final Fantasy X. It should have been called Final Fantasy XI, because everything in this game went to 11. Blitzball strike! Douche! In Final Fantasy X, you play as Tidus, star player of the Xanarkin Abes, a guy who, unlike all other Final Fantasy main characters, doesn't know a thing about swordplay, or magic, or fighting battles, or anything, or even chocobos. All he fucking knows is playing games all day in an imaginary world that doesn't even really exist. Does that sound familiar to anyone? No? My mistake. So then, thanks to the giant monster known as Sin, Tidus gets sucked into the world of Spira, a world not of his own, with dangers and perils, the likes of which he has never seen, seemingly to be around every corner. And it takes all of about 5 minutes for him to realize that as many years of gaming skills, as many years of blitzball skills, now count for shit. Tidus is about to discover the greatest game of all, survival. Yes, I said survival. And in the world of Final Fantasy X, survival is a game in which all of Spira is desperately trying to win against the never-ending onslaught, the never-ending cycle of death and destruction that is Sin. Tidus is gonna have to learn how to fight alongside a team unlike any he has ever encountered before in Blitzball, Waka, Lulu, Kimari, Riku, Sir Auron, and most importantly of all, Lady Yuna. Summoner Lady Yuna is going on a pilgrimage to save the world from sin, but exactly at what cost to bring about the everlasting calm? What cost indeed? Sacrifice, survival, and sacrifice. That's Final Fantasy X in a nutshell right there, and that's why it's so fucking awesome. Because they're themes I hope every person on this planet can relate to. Now, I know way back on my Super Metroid video, I teased Final Fantasy X and said that was the reason I stopped playing new games. But no, that is not true. Obviously, I love this fucking game. The games I hated that made me stop playing modern RPGs was Final Fantasy X-2 and Kingdom Hearts. You have no idea how sick I am of hearing about stupid Kingdom Hearts.
What did you just say?
I hate Kingdom Hearts.
Say it again to my face.
I hate them.
Come again?
I hate all the Kingdom Hearts games in the whole world! But I'll tell you what I don't hate. Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Earthbound. And that is exactly what we'll be talking about on the next episode of JMB on RPGs. Thank you to everyone for listening. If you like my videos, please subscribe. I'll see you all soon. Bye.